right, good stuff. Okay, thank you very much for having me. It's a real honour to be here. Thank you, SV, for inviting me, and for Royal Canin for sponsoring the session. I just looked over there and saw this weird woman. Sorry, that's awful. It's nothing like looking at yourself, but there you go. So my role in wound management is to help you get the best outcome first time. So how many of you were in the workshops with us earlier today and yesterday? Excellent. So some of the slides may be a little familiar. You may know the punchlines to the jokes that I make, so sorry if you hear them again, but some of the slides will be similar, but I have often been told that every time I present these subjects, it's different, but there are some pretty gruesome pictures as well. So really what I want to do this evening is give you an idea of the physiology of wound healing, and I believe we're breaking at 7:30, that's right, for something to eat, so that's fine. That should work out fine anyway. So we'll go through the physiology and a little bit about how wounds heal, but also what dressings to use on which wounds. So we have been quite impressed with the whole range of products that SV do stock, and I do know that when we were doing the workshops, it's quite amazing to see how much stuff is in the portfolio. And when we were ordering products to demonstrate during the workshops, it's amazing to see there's bandaging, there's wound dressings, there's all sorts of things. So what I'm going to do is tell you how all of these things work, but I'm also going to show you that these things aren't magic, and actually it's the principle of wound management that is going to get you to manage wounds better while utilising the products that you've got available. So which button do I press? The green one. There you are. Okay, so this is a little bit about me. So I'm the one without the four legs. I'm the one with the cuddling my horse. So I have a horse. We have a small farm in England. I live in the east of England, which is the round bit in the middle, just above London, and we live right in the middle. I'm as far from the sea as you can get, so it's quite novel to be next to the sea here. I've been, I can't believe it's 15 years in the veterinary world, but I did study podiatry, which is a little bit like chiropody. It's foot science, but also with biomechanics, and I got to understand a lot about physiology of patients with diabetes and how their wounds don't necessarily heal very well. And in humans, if you have a wound that doesn't heal, sometimes it can take 2 to 3 years to heal. And I used to deal with these wounds, and I'd look at them and I would think I was going to be the person that caused the infection and the patient to lose their leg, and it would be extremely scary. So I used to go to the dressings cupboard and I used to go, I'm going to pick the most toxic thing that's going to kill every bacteria in this wound so that whatever is in there, I'm going to kill it, and this patient is not going to die of an infection because it was my fault. And then what I would do is I would book the patient in for a day when I wasn't going to be on duty next week so that somebody else could pick up what was left, and hopefully that patient would still be alive, but someone more intelligent could pick a dressing that was more appropriate. And what ended up happening is I never saw the same patient twice. I never knew whether my interventions made any difference. I never knew if I was actually any good at it, and I scared myself to death. So every time a wound came in, I would hide. I'd hide in the loo. How many of you do that? Some of you maybe? No one hides, do you? Some people love a good wound. You may be here because you're one of those people that likes to watch on YouTube when people are squashing spots. Some of you do that. How many of you watch the pimple popper? Yeah, a few of you. Okay, so we are a very funny breed. Actually, I haven't mentioned this in the previous lectures, but I did some history of wound management, and it turns out there are documentation of monkeys actually having communities that actually look after each other and will take out thorns from each other, and they will actually actively soothe each other when there is pain, and there is also some video footage of a monkey actually extracting a tooth from another monkey and actually getting them to eat a plant beforehand which has some anesthetic properties. Isn't that amazing? So actually apparently healthcare started, the community system started with monkeys, so we are naturally evolving to manage ourselves and look after ourselves, but we really we have evolved, I think, to love squeezing spots. I think it's just one of those things that some of us just love to do. So I trained in wound management, and then I ended up in sales and in a wound management company where I realised that a lot of the products used on animals are from human healthcare, but they don't necessarily come with any instructions. So you may see that you have products on your shelves, or you may find that there are products available for humans that you want to use on animals, and there isn't really any regulation to say that you can't. So you can get the benefits of modern wound management and use them for animals. And when I set up on my own with the Vet Wound Library, it was my principle to help you find out what products do what, to make sure that the products that are available and the technologies that are being developed find their way to the veterinary patient so that you can benefit from them. So this is the work that I do now. I work with companies to help them find new products. I help them find products that are going to be of benefit. So the product like Xarasil, that's a very new product, and I know the lady that has developed that product, and she actually sent me some information on it some time ago, and I said, if you tell me what's in it, I'll tell you whether I like it or not, because I get a lot of people sending me products and things with all sorts of things in. And a lot of people will say, if it's got natural ingredients, it's going to be amazing. And many of us know that arsenic is natural. I don't want it in my tea, and I don't want it in my face cream. So just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe, but actually some of the ingredients are very simple in Xarasil and very effective and very safe. So I was really impressed that it was a simple but a very nice product that does exactly what it needs to do and nothing more. So Derek Nottenbelt is my hero. Does anybody know of Derek Nottenbelt? Some of you maybe. He maybe needs to come over here and do an equine talk. Do any of you deal with horses here? Not many of you? No, that's great, because it is a small animal talk. That's good. I do like to check, because sometimes you get people who come and sneak in when different species. But people say that horses are hard to deal with in terms of wounds. So they say these wounds don't heal very well. And Professor Derek Nottenbelt has always said, well, actually I don't agree. He said, I think horses heal very well. Actually, you have to take away the inhibitors of healing, the things that are slowing healing down, like dead tissue, foreign body. If you have tissue deficit, if there's a lot of tissue missing, it's going to take a long time to heal. If you have distal limb wounds, you've got less tissue elasticity, so, okay, those wounds are going to take longer to heal than if you've got a wound to the body where there's more elasticity. So he says there's no evolutionary advantage to a wound that doesn't heal. It's not very sensible for us to evolve as humans and animals to have wounds that don't heal, because we just wouldn't be here. Do you see what I mean? So actually we have evolved to have a very clever mechanism for our bodies to replace the deficit of tissue after a wound and to remodel and to create tissue that replaces that we've lost. And the problem being sometimes that tissue isn't always as good as the tissue we had before. So lions and tigers, maybe they fight for dominance. Some animals will fight for dominance. That is actually actively encouraging wounding, so they have evolved to heal very well. So scar tissue, it is bound to be there if you've got a wound. And what I was saying to everybody today is that if you have products available and a company comes to you and says this product will heal a wound without a scar, I usually tell that company that they're lying and they don't know their physiology, because actually every wound needs a scar. And I say, apparently it's a good place here to get some facial surgery, so I should have stayed a bit longer and had invested in a bit. But do you know of when you have a facelift, they hide the suture margins in your hairline because no one wants to see the scar and give it away that you've been cheating on looking younger. Now, if they were able to do healing without scarring, it really wouldn't matter where your incisions were. So you will always get a scar, whether you like it or not. So I thought I'd show you something disgusting just to put you off your dinner, because that means there's a lot more for me. So sorry, I should have warned you. Sorry. Do you want me to go back while you brace yourselves? Sorry, that is pretty horrible. Sorry, I should have given you a health warning. There is a thing that is feet, that's what I used to deal with, and something like that would come into a clinic with a patient attached to it, with the patient quite oblivious to the fact that their foot was dead, apart from the fact that they kept falling over. What would happen is that these patients have got a very bad blood supply, they're diabetic. Don't panic if you're diabetic. This doesn't tend to happen unless you've got a blocked artery, which is exactly what was the problem with this patient. So this patient had a poor blood supply. They didn't have any sensation in their feet, so actually they were wearing their slippers and they didn't want to go into hospital, so they just ignored it and hoped that it would all go away, until one of the members of the family said, we really have to do something about this because summer is coming, the flies are going to come out, and you're going to have maggot therapy all on your own, if you see what I mean, which does happen. So this poor person has got necrotic toes, so they've got ischemia, they've got no blood supply to the toes. The body has demarcated what is viable and what isn't, and you can see there's a lot of sloughing and dead material. So the body has its way of getting rid of the dead stuff and finding its margin of tissue that is viable. So I'm sorry, Derek Nottenbelt's principle, if I'm making anybody ill, just put your hand up and say enough, because I might go too far, but Derek Nottenbelt calls it the pizza principle. He says you need to get rid of the burnt bits and the cheese until you get down to a nice tomato base, and then you've got a nice vascular bed, and a stuffed crust is not desirable, so we don't want mozzarella cheese stuck under anything. Now, I'm going to show you a worse picture, but brace yourselves, don't look if you don't want to see it. But that was the picture from the bottom, which is pretty gruesome. Now, it is horrible, but I just want you to think about a degloving injury in a cat or a dog, and it's really not that different. It's just you are tuned in to looking at tendons and bones of cats and dogs, and you will see that dragged along the road, and if you show that to a human surgeon or someone who looks at this, they will be equally horrified because that cat is much more important, you know, they have much more of an emotive response. But really, this patient was managed conscious. Do you see his arms are in the background? He sat there with his arms in the air waiting for everything to be done. And really what they do is they nip off the dead tissue. It's the same principle as every wound: prepare, promote, and protect. So you get rid of the dead stuff, you clean the wound back, you get down to the healthy granulation tissue, and then you allow the wound to heal so that it granulates in. And you can take photos of this wound because this was posted on LinkedIn all over the place. And it was actually a patient who received maggot therapy. They did actually intentionally use maggots to help clean this wound up. And maggots produce proteases, just like macrophages, like white blood cells, which help dissolve the protein-rich material, help clean up all that slough and debris, and it helps the wounds granulate more quickly. Now I'm going to show you something magic. Look how well it did. And that was within weeks of having the surgery to fix the arterial flow in that leg. So if we are looking at the inhibitors of healing, if something looks really bad and it's non-healing, think about the fact that there will be a factor there that is delaying healing, and that may be dead tissue, it may be heavy contamination, it might be a biofilm. If you have orthopedic implants and the granulation tissue won't grow over the implant, there may be a biofilm on the implant which is causing the macrophages to produce more proteases, which get that wound to be stuck in the inflammatory phase so that it cannot progress. So it really is very simple. They're feedback mechanisms. The wound healing starts from the moment of hemostasis when the injury happens. Then you get macrophage activity, inflammation, yellow, redness, swelling, and then macrophages produce proteases. They break down the dead stuff, and if they don't stop, that wound keeps getting stuck in inflammation until that dead stuff has gone. Do you get grass seed problems here? Probably not. Sand in wounds, maybe? If you have a foreign body in a wound, in the UK we get a lot of issues with dogs running through fields with wheat. So they'll have the grass seed that will go up the dog's nose, and it will maybe lodge somewhere in the body, and you can end up with a sinus tract. And until you remove the grass seed, the wound will not heal. And people are using antibiotics to get this wound to heal because they think there's pus coming out and there's exudate coming out. It's not going to fix it. The infection is not the problem is the foreign body. Do you see what I mean? So inflammation always has a reason. If a wound is not progressing, it's stuck in inflammation. If you can find the reason for the chronic inflammation, fix that, then the wound will progress to heal because the proteases will stop being produced, the granulation tissue will be like flicking a switch, and granulation tissue will start to form at the base of the wound, and the wound will start to look lovely and red like a tomato or even watermelon, you could say watermelon, lovely. And then the epithelial cells around the edges of the wound or at the remnants of hair follicles will start to migrate across the wound. And all the collagen fibers that the fibroblasts are laying down, we love fibroblasts, they're my favourite. Have you heard of a non-surgical facelift? Anyone heard of this? There's a few people nodding at the back. If you had one, no. I always say if you get offered one of these, you want to do a buy one, get one free. Have you heard of this? Buy one, get one free? Do you get this here? Oh, it's an offer you get in England, and they call it bog off. Buy one, get one free. So it means if you buy something, you get an extra free. Now, what tends to happen is that fibroblasts, this story does add up in a minute. I do that. I go sort of off topic, and then I'll come back to it. Don't worry. So when your wounds are granulating, your vascular tissue is growing up through the wound. If that vascular tissue, this is really weird, but if I'm waving my arms in the air like some seaweed, if that vascular tissue is floating around in exudate and the wound is moving, it's very fragile, it's going to break. So what it needs is a matrix of collagen in which to grab hold of so that that vascular tissue can start to fill the wound bed. And that's where your granulation tissue comes on from and gets its robustness as it starts to grow into collagen. Fibroblasts lay down collagen, and they start doing that 4 days after injury. So once inflammation has subsided, if you clean that wound, those wounds will start to produce collagen. They will start to lay down a matrix of collagen. That collagen is then remodeled. Once the vascular tissue grows into it, it's then recycled, and fibroblasts will lay it down again in layers and layers and layers till they reach the edges of the wound, and you touch the wound margin, and they touch the wound margin. So your wound starts to get to the edges and starts to get so that it's all level. Once those fibroblasts and that collagen reaches the edges and you fill that wound up, then they flick a switch and the fibroblasts turn into myofibroblasts. What does myo mean? Does anyone know what myo means? Muscle, excellent. So they have muscle properties. They pull the edges of the wound together, and you see that this wound starts to shrink and the edges come in, and the scar tissue will never be as big as the original wound because they are strongly pulling the edges of that wound together. So if you have a Shar-Pei, do you know a Shar-Pei dog? Shar-Pei dog with lots and lots of skin. You have a big wound, and that wound contraction will pull the edges of the wound together, and you'll get a tiny scar because there's a lot of spare skin. If you have a greyhound, you won't get as much closure because it's much tighter. It's much less available skin. So those fibroblasts, any idea what you can kill them with? Chlorhexidine. So chlorhexidine washes and wound washes, if you use those when a wound is granulating, you kill fibroblasts, you stop that collagen deposition, and you will stop the wound contraction. So we have to be aware of the phases of healing, that it's okay to use antiseptics in the inflammatory phase when the wound is yellow. You can use things that kill bacteria and help you debride when the wound is yellow. But when the wound is granulating, you want to look after every cell possible. You can keep the wound moist. And what they found is if you keep the wound bed moist, I don't know if you're familiar with hydrogels, but you get wounds, a hydrogel which is usually an alginate, which is seaweed, or a plant-based cell, the word of it. They call it sodium carboxymethylcellulose, so it's a plant cellulose which is hydrated with water. So you have this gel that you put on the wound, and that keeps your granulation bed nice and healthy and comfortable so that those cells can migrate and contract. So everything is very, very predictable. If you watch a wound all the way through, and instead of doing what I did, which was giving that wound to somebody else to look after, you will see that they progress beautifully and predictably. The only thing that we can do with wound dressings is to help these wounds progress as efficiently as possible so that ideally we get the wound closed within 4 to 6 weeks. Because these fibroblasts get very tired at around 4 to 6 weeks and they stop pulling the edges together. So how many of you have seen a tumour removal where you do really well on a lower limb and you take this tumour off this lower limb, you know it's benign, but you're left with a big hole. And everything is healing really nicely for the first 2 or 3 weeks. And then you think, okay, well, we don't need reconstruction here. And then at 4 to 6 weeks, everything gets very slow. And the bandages start to rub. And then you find that the owner gets very impatient, or you start to think, we need a dressing. And you ring up SV and you say, what have you got? What's magic? What's new? And they say, we've got Xarasil, so you try that. and the wound still doesn't close fast enough for you. It's not the Xarasil, it's the fact that it is in that phase of healing where things really do slow down. So the art of wound management is getting the wound bed to a healthy granulation stage, like this one over here, and then deciding whether surgery is going to replace the tissue loss more effectively than allowing it to close by second intention. Does that make sense with everyone? The cases that we see through the vet wound library tend to be that people are looking at these wounds and thinking, we'll just leave it another week and see if it shrinks a bit more. We'll just leave it another week. And you find that you have wounds that cost a lot of money because they've been bandaged for months and months and months, and they're not progressing. When actually what would have been better is if somebody had had some advice early, at the first 10 days is ideal, on how to close that wound with reconstruction once your wound bed is healthy. Because once your wound bed is granulating, and it looks like tomato base or watermelon, it is as healthy as it's ever going to be for reconstruction to be successful. If you leave it much longer, and if you leave it weeks and weeks, that collagen deposition gets more and more fibrous, it gets more and more tough, and it gets harder for your graft or for anything else to take over the top. So you want healthy, nice, soft, viable vascular tissue in order to reconstruct over. So I did say about this non-surgical facelift. So whenever you get people saying that if you have these little tiny injections in your skin, or these laser that bursts your blood vessels in your skin, I'm just going to show you what happens, but, oh, sorry about that. Don't know why I put that in there. I'm moving on because we won't have time. But we have hemostasis. So if I'm going to put these little lasers in my cheeks, it's going to burst some blood vessels. Those blood vessels will burst. The platelets will stick together. The platelets release their contents into the wound, into that area. Platelets will then cause it to swell, redness, pain. So the advice is go and stay indoors for 2 days because you're going to look a bit puffy. And you go, okay, that's fine, you warned me. And then you get the inflammation peaks at 2 days. Then new vascular tissue is going to grow. And about 4 days after injury, inflammation subsides. And then guess what happens at about 6 to 7 days? I get contraction. What's that going to do to my face? It's going to tighten it. So what happens is my cheeks will start to tighten. The collagen deposition will plump them up a wee bit, and I will look like I've had a bit of collagen implants and a slight tightening, which sounds great. Let's all stick needles in our faces. I did wonder about it at one point. Unfortunately, scar tissue remodeling means that collagen will be remodeled into type 2 collagen, which is more aligned and softer, more supple. It gives the wound more tensile strength and more stretch, which means that within about 6 months, everything's going to go back to exactly how it was because all of those fibres are going to be more supple and softer again. So that's why I say if you do a non-surgical facelift, it may last you 6 months. If you buy one, get one free, it's a good idea because you will need one again. Do you see what I mean? But that is the process of healing. Anything that has inflammation involved, every time you cut into a patient, every time you make an incision, you have an inflammatory response, wound remodeling, reconstruction, scar tissue formation, remodeling, and scar maturation, and that is the process of healing, which gets us exactly to 9:30. So what I was going to do is, after the break, if you like, are you happy to take the break on time and we take that now? Or I think, oh, where did that go? Oh, I pressed the wrong button, sorry. There we go, I'll just finish these ones. So the problem with scar tissue, it's not the same as hair-covered tissue. So as we have here, we have a dog here that had a mast cell tumour removed, and it left a big deficit of tissue, which they tried to close, and it was under an awful lot of tension. So failure to heal is usually due to tension. It may be due to a tissue deficit. It may be that it's over the stifle. So when the patient was on the table, a fairly often thing that happens is that people will, in surgery, when the patient's lying down, be able to pull the edges together. But then when the dog is sitting up or standing up, that motion at the stifle means that it keeps putting those suture margins under incredible tension, which means they pop open and you end up with these. So with this mast cell tumour removal, they've allowed this to close by second intention. It's healing beautifully, but it has taken some time. There is a way to calculate how long it takes. I don't know if I have laser on there. Do I have a laser? I do. So you can calculate how long it takes for this tissue by looking at the epithelial margin. And that epithelial margin, possibly in this area, you could look at 2 millimeters every 10 days. So you can actually calculate how long it's taken to get to this point. So 2 millimeters, a couple of months, maybe a month or so, that's not unreasonable for this one. And then I did some magic here, which I was showing off, and everybody's had to look at this. But you can see it start to heal, and it's not necessarily the most beautiful wound, but it'll do the job if people don't mind a scar. But it does mean that that scar tissue doesn't have hair covering, it doesn't have sebum, so it doesn't have the natural protection against antimicrobial effect that sebum will have. It may not have the sensation that it normally would do. So sometimes proprioception, sensory denervation can mean the patient is more prone to injuries. If you think of pads of paws, facial wounds, a lack of whiskers will mean that the patient is not able to find its way as much. And it may also lack things that are a defensive mechanism against infections, such as Langerhans cells and cells that are your natural defense. But melanocytes as well, so there's no defense against the sunshine. And dogs certainly that are in the sunshine or in countries where it's very hot and very sunny, if they don't have melanocytes, they don't have any protection against UV. And what may happen is that sunlight may cause cell disruption beneath the surface of that scar, and it may cause tumor formation. So we have seen in horses that have been in fires, where the horse has had a barn fire, and people try to get these horses to heal. All across their backs, they pretty much guaranteed tend to get sunshine-related or light-related tumor formation because of the damage that's there and the lack of hair follicles and the protection that it's got. So the best thing to replace a wound with is the patient's own skin, so hair-covered skin, which has the potential for sebum and the protection. It also looks better rather than scar tissue, but not everyone can get to that point. So there are three things that you need to bear in mind when you're managing wounds based on your options available. And based on the physiology of healing, you want to consider these three things. Can you achieve a functional cosmetic repair with the resources you have available? So in this case, could they achieve a functional cosmetic repair with their resources? Possibly not. Maybe they should have considered reconstruction. They can seek help for that and find a different way to reconstruct. Of over 800 cases that we have in the library, 15% have been cases where people have asked for help after they've done mast cell tumour removal or tumour removal, where when the patient's on the table, they say, oh my God, we've got a big hole. Or they say, we've had to take away a lot more than we had. And it's a case of that they didn't plan or have a plan for such a big deficit before they made it. So creating the margins, planning for what might happen once you've taken that off is usually the issue. So you want a functional cosmetic repair, relief of pain and distress. So that means, is it better for the animal to come into the practice 3 or 4 times a week for the next 6 months if it's a kitten with a degloving? Or maybe that kitten is happier with 3 legs and it can get back to being a kitten in 2 weeks' time. I know of a case of a lady who bought a horse that was very cheap because it had a wound on its leg, and she thought that she would be able to train this 4-year-old horse to be an eventer. So she bought the horse for not a lot of money, just a few pounds, but she spent 18 months managing this horse to get this wound to heal by second intention, by which point it had been in the stable for 18 months. It was now weaving, it had psychological problems, it hadn't been doing anything, and she hadn't sat on the horse. Whereas with grafting, skin grafting, you can do some very straightforward grafting. The technique is really quite simple once you master it. As long as the key to grafting is putting it onto a healthy granulation bed and minimizing movement for the next 7 days. If they'd done that, she could have been riding it in 90 days. So we have several cases where just some simple pinch grafts into equine wounds means that you can get a large wound healed within 90 days as opposed to 18 months. So that is relief of pain and distress, which means, you know, the distress was for the patient to be incarcerated for so long, and then a rapid return to normal use. So can you get that animal back to normal use as quickly as possible? So that's where we look at that 18 months. So does that make sense? It's in the BSAVA manual that kind of says functional cosmetic repair, relief of pain and distress, and a rapid return to normal use. And that's kind of your mantra in the back of your head saying, can we do this? Do we need to refer? Do we need to phone someone? Do we need to ask for help? And that will always help you very well. So I think that's probably a good point at which to say, after the break, what we're going to go through is my principles, or the principles that we teach in terms of good wound management and how to best manage or work with the process of healing so you can get the best possible outcome. All right? So is everybody happy? All right, so I think now's a good time to have your break. I think we're back in here at 8 o'clock. Is that right? Am I right with that? Correct me if I'm wrong. Lovely, and then we'll have our next session. Okay. No need to clap. You can clap later if you're still happy.
Okay, everyone, if you can make your way through the double doors at the back, get some snacks, and if you can come back here for 8 o'clock, that's perfect. Hello everyone, welcome back. Just before we get started, somebody's dropped their valet parking ticket outside, so I've got it with me. When you get a chance to check, if you think it might be yours, if you can't find yours, then let me know. If it's to a Porsche, odds are I'll be long gone, but worth a try.
Try not to fall over. I may fall over later. Okay. Oh, I just caught sight of myself again. Does anyone else have the same thing? They don't like the sound of their own voice. When you hear it on the phone and you're like, oh. Anyway, you're here to listen to me. Sorry about that. So, following on from earlier, I'm going to take you through the principles of wound management using prepare, promote and protect. So it's just a simple way of remembering what stages you need to go through to get to a nicely healed wound. It's not rocket science. I don't know if that works here, saying rocket science, but it's not a miracle, but it really, really does work in helping you get these wounds healed as effectively as possible. So I'm just going to take you through some images. Oh, is that got some feedback? What have I done? Can that go away? No, okay. So by preparing wounds, what we're looking at is, it's called wound bed preparation, if you read about it in human healthcare. And what it does is it removes all the debris, all the dead tissue, and it helps to get that wound bed clean, ready for you to either reconstruct or to give this wound a period of open wound management until you get through the inflammatory phase of healing, at which point it will start to granulate and then you can close. So we now have a fresh traumatic wound. And how many hours do you think this might be? I'll let you know, it's only 2 or so. So it's a very, very early wound that it can be lavaged thoroughly. Who would close this wound at 2 hours? At 2 hours old, would you close this wound? I think a lot of people would close this or try to close it, even or refer it maybe. But even with whatever the type of wound, there is a process to clipping and lavaging that wound. So best practice, or if you're allowed to say that, but good practice is to clip around the edges of the wound and clip a wide margin in case you need to reconstruct and you need to bring tissue in from elsewhere. So a lot of specialists will say, don't be afraid to clip a big area because it's nothing more frustrating than finding out you need a piece of tissue from over there and it's covered in hair and you've got to bring the patient round, sedate them again later and do it all over again. So be prepared to do that. And then before you clip, you fill the wound with a hydrogel. So that's KY jelly, a sterile hydrogel, ideally a clean tube. If you've got a very large wound like this one, you can actually fill it with sterile ultrasound gel. As long as it's water soluble, the idea is that any hair that falls in that wound while you're clipping it is going to fall onto the gel so that you can flush it away. Hair is actually very hard for the body to biodegrade. So I used to deal with a lady who had a dog that she used to sleep with. She used to sleep with her dog every night. I mean, you know, if you love your dog, why not? But she had very bad feet, very poor circulation, and every 6 weeks when I used to go and do her feet for her, I used to have to pull hairs out from her toes, and she had these little pustules of hair. It was pretty gross, sorry. And she ran a pub, and I tell you, having seen her feet and her upstairs bedroom, there's no way I would eat there. But if you get hair that falls in a wound, it will delay healing and it will cause inflammation to be prolonged. So we don't want to get hair in the wound. And then to lavage that wound with a volume of solution, and a good idea of solution is 100 mils per centimetre of wound. So for a 10 centimetre laceration, you want a litre of saline. That's quite a lot more than a lot of people use. So we've done some audits of wound management in veterinary practice in the UK, and a lot of people use too little saline or too little water to lavage wounds. The other thing that is really interesting, and I think I've got a slide to do it next. Oh no, this was the one for that one. I've got another slide later, but the earlier you wash a wound, the more you reduce the bacteria. So the earlier you lavage, the less the bacteria can proliferate and multiply. So if you think about a biofilm formation in a wound, the bacteria get comfortable, they create a protein coat, and they start to glue themselves to the surface of the wound bed. After about 6 hours, it gets harder to flush that biofilm away, which means that that wound is more likely to break down when you close it, because that biofilm hasn't been shifted by lavage solution. So if you use your lavage solution through a 20 ml syringe and a 19 to 20 gauge needle, and you can put it through a bag or through a drip set or a three-way tap, you can push that through, and that will achieve 18 to 15 pounds per square inch, which is a good pressure to dislodge bacteria, but not too strong to push it deeper into the wound. So there's a lot of research to say that good pressure, it's quite a high pressure to push that fluid through, will dislodge bacteria. So just flushing it, dripping it is not enough. You need to get the pressure in there. So yes, here is my naughty story. Some of you noticed this already. For those of you who've seen it already, this is my famous story. Unfortunately, it's called the poo story. It's one of those silly stories that's really disgusting. But the moral of the story is, if you find a big poo in the loo, do you spray chlorhexidine at it and hope it will go away? Or do you flush it? And this is something that I teach all the students when I'm teaching vet students who are never going to remember what they learned in their second year. But what they do remember, excuse my language, is to flush the shit out of the wound. You would never leave a toilet without flushing it, and it's the same with a wound. So any veterinary nurses in here, if you're standing next to your surgeon and they're not putting enough fluid through that wound, you have to say, do remember to flush the shit out first, and then you can use your antiseptic to decontaminate the bowl. Do you see what I mean? Your antiseptic's pointless if you leave all the debris in there. It's still not going to heal. Do you see what I mean? It's a lot longer story, the version I told earlier today, but we don't have it long enough for me to give you the full embellished version. So you will see that there are products available to spray into wounds that are readily available, that you can buy over the counter, that you see in the supermarket or in the chemist, that say this will kill bacteria, it will kill this and kill that. My feeling is if it kills bacteria, its chances are it could potentially kill healthy skin cells too. So if you think of mucous membranes, how many of you use chlorhexidine on mucous membranes and eyes? You wouldn't use it around eyes because it can damage the eye and it can damage the surface of the eye. If you think about where we evolved from, we possibly evolved from single-celled creatures, much like bacteria. And some of our cells are probably not dissimilar. So if we use chlorhexidine and iodine and hydrogen peroxide on all of these cells, if it kills a bacteria, it could well kill some of our cells as well. So using antiseptics is all about a balance of using products that don't damage the cells, but that when there is a good enough reason, such as a bite wound, so if a cat bite wound, you know that a cat bite and puncture wounds, they inoculate a very small area with a huge volume of bacteria, and depending on the virulence of that bacteria, that infection can spread very, very fast. So in which case, the short-term gain of using something that's going to kill those bacteria outweighs the potential risk of infection. Do you see what I mean? So if you have a large open wound like the one before, some of the specialists would say, do you know what, we would only use saline or Hartmann solution or even tap water. So it is actually okay to use tap water if it's warm tap water, and the client can use that at home to lavage a wound, and they do it early. By doing that early, they will reduce the risk of infection massively. So there's a lovely bit of research that showed for every hour earlier you wash a wound, the volume of bacteria is reduced by half, which is really cool. So it just goes to show there's nothing clever you can put on wounds, but if you flush them first, you will do an awful lot of good. So that is enough to dislodge bacteria that will form a biofilm in the time that it takes for that patient to get to you. Okay. So I put in a little nod to Cruiser. So Cruiser do supply SV companies, and Cruiser have a whole range of products, and this is their flushing unit, which delivers a pressure of 8 to 15 pounds per square inch. So this is what it looks like. It's quite a high pressure. It goes quite a long way if you spray it at somebody. So do you mind pressing play for the video for me so you can see how it goes? So this is really a pump unit under pressure with a kind of dental irrigation system on the end, and you can use that to do that. Please press play. Can you do that for me? Well done. So that is dislodging bacteria in a fresh laceration in a horse. The horse is sedated. And sometimes, no, I won't say that, but that will be enough to dislodge bacteria if you lavage it thoroughly. And the cruiser also do a sachet of powder that turns normal tap water into lactated ringer solution. So you can put 3 litres into that unit, put the sachet in it, mix it, and that will become a balanced electrolyte solution for you to wash your wounds with. So maybe if you have people with a lot of dogs, or it's probably more relevant to equine or training places, if they can lavage the wound with something like that, that would be great. Just so you know it's there. And no antimicrobial, even the honey that these guys are is a substitute for wound debridement. There is no excuse for getting rid of the dead stuff out of a wound, such is the loo story, which is why you flush the poo or you remove the solids before you do the next step. And I was impressed by this picture of this horse here. I know we're talking small animal, but this is flamazine all over this wound. Have you heard of flamazine? Silver sulfadiazine? I think you have this here. And this is a great picture of a wound that's been on this horse for some time. You can see it's exuding quite a lot. There's a lot of bioburden, a lot of dead stuff. But what impresses me most that it's probably got a fairly new shoe on. So I don't know if someone's riding it with this on here. But by putting flamazine all over the top of that, my feeling is they're hoping it's going to go away. Do you see what I mean? And I think that's what people sometimes do with the silver sulfadiazine. They think, not sure what to do with this, I'm going to cake it all over the wound, send the patient home, and fingers crossed it'll be okay. When actually, if you debride that wound fully, you might not like what you see underneath, but you will be dealing with the wound bed that then doesn't need the flamazine or the sulfadiazine because it's now clean and you only need to do your hydrogels, if you like. Do you have Febreze here? Is that a product that you buy here? Air freshener that gets rid of smells? So I say that silver sulfadiazine is like this air freshener. If I have people into my house and they're going to come for dinner and my house smells because there's lots of bacteria, because bacteria create the sulfur compounds that make everything smell yucky. So if my house smells yucky because it's dirty, I can spray my stuff around so it masks the smell so everyone thinks everything is lovely, which is what the silver sulfadiazine is doing. Or I could clean my house and then I don't need the air freshener. Do you see what I mean? That's the same with sulfadiazine. It's a good product. It's really good at yeasts. It's good at fungi. It's good at killing microbes. But it's not a substitute for doing a proper job, if you see what I mean. So if you do use antimicrobials, there's lots available. So there are some different types. We've got some silver dressings, lots of silver. Silver sulfadiazine is one, combined with other things. Fusiderm, fusidic acid, acetic acid, which is vinegar. There's all sorts of different things. The guy up here who is blue, have you ever seen a blue man? Other than the Smurfs. Have you heard of the Smurfs? They're quite old now. This guy is blue because he makes his own silver colloidal solution, which is you get an electrolysis kit, which you can buy in America or buy it online. And that you put an electric charge through this with one cathode and an anode, and it creates nanoparticulate silver in a solution which has a positive charge, which you drink that, and they think that that is going to help keep away COVID and various other things. But what it also does is particulate silver is a heavy metal that binds to proteins, and it makes you go blue, which is incredible. So he's quite proud of being blue, but I'm not sure it's a good look. So silver is a heavy metal. If you use too much of it, it can stain the tissue. It will stain white dogs, white cats. It will make their coat brown. If the patient is going home to somebody's house and they have white furniture, the silver sulfadiazine will stain brown because that turns into a silver salt. I think there are better products out there. So silver just kills bacteria. It doesn't do anything else. So people often ask me what is the difference between silver and honey, because they both do the same thing. They are both as effective as each other when it comes to killing bacteria. And the difference between honey and silver is honey will help you debride and clean the wound up. It will help you soften dead tissue because it has an osmotic effect, whereas silver just creates a layer of antimicrobial. Do you see the difference? One is actively helping you debride and kill bacteria. The other one is just creating a barrier, which is going to stop the wound leaking bacteria, contamination getting in, and has a slightly topical effect. My attitude, it's better to debride the wound and decontaminate than it is to just put that on for effect. So debridement can be done anyway. How many people want to just peel that bit off? You know, that tissue is dead, it's demarcated. You can see there's granulation tissue underneath. That's going to heal beautifully once you take that away. So there are different ways to debride wounds, and we can call those surgical, sharp debridement, doing that with a scalpel, mechanical debridement, which would be peeling that off, wet to dry dressings. Who does wet to dry dressings? So saline-soaked gauze that you place into a wound that's got debris and contamination in it. You can suture that in place, or you can hold that in place to allow that to dry out overnight. And then the next day, under anesthesia, under sedation, you pull that off and it pulls all the dead bits with it. It's like waxing your legs or your eyebrows. It takes everything with it, and it's jolly painful. So one of the surgeons that we used to use as an advisor, he was a surgeon at Dick White Referrals, and he also was a cyclist, a very keen cyclist. And any time we had a case over, he would say, this wound needs 2 days of wet to dry dressings. So that would mean that you're going to put this gauze on for a day, take it off, put it on again, take it off. And that, he would say, this freshens the wound up. It makes it bleed. So if you imagine a wound that's 4 to 6 weeks old and it gets stuck and tired, you do 2 days of wet to dry, it makes it bleed, you start that whole physiological process again and add in some more fresh inflammation. So what happened? He fell off his bike and he skidded along the road, and being a very good surgeon, he held his arms in the air so he didn't ruin his hands, because he needed them on Monday, and he skidded along his hip. And guess what he treated himself with? He did a wet to dry dressing. It's the first time in his life he fainted when he took it off. He said it was the most painful experience of his life. So that is what you need to bear in mind, is that it is painful, but it is jolly effective. So as is hydrogen peroxide, I can say that that is also extremely painful. If you look at YouTube, and there's a guy who has road rash from falling off a bike, who puts hydrogen peroxide on there, and I swear to God, his voice changed 3 octaves when he put it on, and he squeals like a little girl. So remember, hydrogen peroxide is not as effective as some of these things that you can get now, and it hurts like hell. But it's good fun listening to this guy scream. Chemical, we won't go into too much, but autolytic is what we're doing when we use honey. Autolytic means natural softening of tissue. It takes a lot longer, but you don't need to sedate the patient and you don't need anesthesia, because it's much more passive and it's much more pain-free. So I'm giving you the options here of what is available as honey. So what we now have is honey, not just from a jar, but we have medical grade honey that has been gamma sterilized. So that means that it's been cold treated to preserve all the enzymes and all the good things that are in the honey that will act as an antimicrobial and help you to debride the wound. And what makes life a lot easier is there is now honey that is impregnated in dressings, so that certainly in hot countries like this one, when you put tube honey onto a wound, it sometimes just dribbles everywhere and it goes everywhere, and it's hard to keep it where you need to put it. So some of these products, this one is my favourite to be fair. Oh, this one, AD. It's honey impregnated into an alginate dressing, which is seaweed. That's often used to stimulate, to help granulation tissue and absorb. And what it does is when you put that in a wound, you cut it to the shape of the wound, you place it in the wound, you can even make a ribbon out of it and pack it into a cavity. And as it absorbs exudate, it turns into a jelly. And that jelly holds the fluid and it keeps the honey where it needs to be, and it's really effective. So that can stay in place for up to 4 days. If you've got a cavity, so that would be all right. But generally I say initially with honey, you want to change the dressing every 2 days, and then as the exudate reduces and the slough disappears, you can go up to 4 days until you get granulation tissue formation, and then you change from a honey to a hydrogel, but we'll explain that in a moment. So I'm going to just explain to you what honey is, and I shouldn't really explain it to you because this is probably one of the countries where you eat a lot of honey, I think, and certainly Middle Eastern areas, there's an awful lot of honey. But Different countries have their different types of honey. In the UK, we have honey from clover. So these are plants with, that cows eat, so you get clover honey. You may get rapeseed honey, which is a mustard type of honey, and different ones, but I'll explain that in a minute. So bees are obviously going to make the honey, and the honey is a food source for their little larvae. So they store the honey in their hives as a supersaturated sugar solution that is 84% sugar, which you can't physically do synthetically. It's because they have a very clever process and some very clever things in it. So some people have used sugar on wounds. Sugar has been quite popular to use on wounds as a way of causing osmosis and drawing fluid through it and softening dead tissue. But you need 40 times as much sugar to achieve the same as a teaspoon. So 40 teaspoons of sugar to 1 teaspoon of honey to get the same effect, if you see what I mean. So that's why honey tends to be better. Now, honey is made up of nectar. So the bees go to the plants. They go up to 3 miles from the hive, and they will go and source nectar from their favourite plants. And that nectar is just a sugary solution produced by the plant, which they will then carry back to the hive. And bees have 2 stomachs, believe it or not, which is nice. They have one that's for themselves, and I say one for dealing, so it's like drugs. And I don't know if that's a naughty thing to say here, but I shouldn't say they have one for personal use and one for passing on to their friends. And in these stomachs of bees, they actually have up to 70 species of bacteria, believe it or not. And these can range from Clostridium tetani, Clostridium botulinum. This is why honey in jars will often say, do not give to children under 1 year of age, because they don't have the immunity against Clostridium to make it safe for them to eat honey that's been pasteurized. So pasteurized honey doesn't necessarily kill the spores of Clostridium botulinum, so it can be considered quite dangerous. But you can see in there they've got E. coli, Klebsiella, all sorts of things. Fortunately, the bees, as they process this honey, have an enzyme in their stomach called glucose oxidase, which stops them getting ill from this bacteria. But some of these bacteria can still be in that sugar solution as they pass it from bee to bee. So the worker bees, the ones that go out and collect the nectar, don't actually process the honey. They pass that nectar on to the bees that wait for them at the opening of the hive, and it's their job to do mouth to mouth. They pass it together, so they do like that. Have you ever played the orange game where you pass it from person to person? It's a bit intimate, it's probably a little bit odd, but you play it sometimes. So the bees pass this nectar from bee to bee in the hive, and as each bee takes the nectar, it takes a little bit of the moisture with it to hydrate itself, and then it passes on the sugar with some glucose oxidase. So as these bees pass it on, by the time it gets to the little babies and the little places and the honeycomb, it's become so concentrated because they've taken the moisture out of it that it becomes honey. And that's why you get the honey. So the honey is this bee, the saturated sugar that's had the moisture taken out as it gets passed along. Unfortunately, because it's so full of glucose oxidase, it becomes antimicrobial, because that means if it gets any moisture in it or any bacteria gets in it, it's strong enough to kill bacteria. And it has a pH of about 3.4, so it's really acidic. So that means not only will the bacteria not survive, but if the bees have the honey in their hive over winter, they're not going to get drunk when it turns to alcohol, which is a real shame, to be honest, but there we are. So I shouldn't say these things. So different plants actually pass on different flavours to honey. So depending on the species of plant, you will get different types of properties. So we have some different plants in here. Now, does anybody know what this one is up here that grows in the UK where I am? And that will be out when I get home in the woods. What? Foxglove, excellent. Yeah, it is a foxglove, and the Latin name is digitalis. And do you know what they use digitalis to make? Digoxin. So if you were to get honey made out of digitalis, you'd have quite a potent cardiac drug. It could be quite potent, it could cause you issues, but fortunately you don't get foxglove honey. Clover honey is a very white, sticky honey. It's very thick. It wouldn't be very good on wounds because it's very granular and it's hard to handle. Orange blossom honey tastes the best, so that's quite expensive. And this one in the corner here is manuka bush, and the manuka bush is the one that all the healthcare people get excited about. because the manuka bush gives honey an extra component called methylglyoxal, which means that even if you take the glucose oxidase out of the honey, the bit that the bees put in, it's still antimicrobial. So that gives it this antimicrobial effect over and above natural honey. And the reason it's slightly more special is that it means the minimum inhibitory concentration of honey that you use is you need far less honey to achieve the same minimum inhibitory concentration in a wound than you would do with standard honey. Does that make sense? Anyone would think I knew something about this? I've done it a few times. So let's be cynical. New Zealand have an export of honey. They make manuka honey. It doesn't taste the best, so they had to do some research and think, we need to sell a load of this stuff. Let's make it medical. So they found this methylglyoxal, and they said, do you know what? If we put this stuff, I can't do a New Zealand accent. Do you know what? If we put this into this, we test it against bacteria. This honey, we tested against 10% phenol, and this particular batch of honey was as effective as 10% phenol against a whole battery of bacteria. You see what I mean? And then they do the same with another batch, and they find that it is as effective as 20% phenol. And they came up with this unique manuka factor that they say plus 20, plus 10. Have you seen that on jars? You only need plus 10 for a wound. And actually the stuff that you get from these guys is actually plus 12. But what you do need to do is you need to get medical grade honey. And the reason for that is that New Zealand can only export 1,800 tonnes. That's all they can make every year. Just in the UK, there are 11,000 tonnes bought every year on the shelves in pots, which means that what's in the pots is not true manuka, or it's blended. So you can say for food purposes that this jar contains 100% manuka honey, but how much manuka honey does it have to have in the jar? Do you see what I mean? Maybe only 1%, 10%. The rules are very slack. So if it's medical grade, it's 100% manuka honey. It will have been filtered and so that there's no bits of bee and no wax in it, so there's no foreign body effect, but it will also have been gamma sterilized. Have I sold it to you yet? So sorry about that. So some of you will have heard of, have anybody heard of Mad Honey? Mad Honey anywhere? Any buyers for Mad Honey? So this is honey that's made in the eastern Black Sea region of Georgia, apparently, and it is made out of honey that is harvested from the mountains in May when they have been feeding off rhododendron. And they sell it to tourists because it makes them go all loopy and hallucinate, apparently. So what it does is it has powerful toxins called granotoxins, which are actually a weapon of war, believe it or not. So I was talking to somebody earlier today, and the Romans were defeated using this stuff. So it would all be very different over here if it hadn't have been for rhododendron honey, because what they did is they left honey for the Romans, and the Romans at the time didn't really have a lot of sweet things, and they thought, well, this is fantastic. They ate the honey, they collapsed, and then they were killed while they were in a state of stupor, which is absolutely fantastic, I think. Well, it's not fantastic. Well, it is, but it's really clever. So if you have to keep it out of the reach of children because they can go into convulsions and actually have heart failure. It's that potent. So the thing is, this is just to show you that you can get spores of Clostridium in honey from a jar, and if you do put honey from a jar on a patient, you are liable for whatever happens. And you might think it's a very rare occurrence, very unlikely. I know people who use it from a jar and they say, never had any problems. Well, the reason I got into the veterinary world is I actually helped bring manuka honey from one company in human healthcare and introduced it to another company in veterinary wound management in the UK. And 2 years in, the veterinary company gave me a phone call, and the vet team rang me and they said, we have just had a call from somebody whose dog has just, a vet, the dog has just got tetanus and they used the honey 2 days before. And this was their medical honey. And they said, I know it's theory, but is it possible that this happened because of the honey? Because the vet practice and the owners say that's what it was. And because it is a medical honey, it has a batch number, it has an expiry date, it has a proper traceability. There is no way that medical grade honey will cause you that. And a horse also has died from Clostridium related to honey. So it is not impossible. It's not worth the liability. And for a tube of honey that you can charge to a client, it's the sensible thing to do. But it is certainly something that we wouldn't do on humans willingly. And this is to show you what else grows in honey. If you buy cheap honey, this is supermarket honey, this one here. This is a well-known UK supermarket. I won't name them because they might sue me because I know you're recording it. And their value honey grew more bacteria than were in the test sample that they were testing against. So they actually grew Klebsiella and Proteus from this value honey, and that's because it was a very dilute solution. It was a very poor version of honey, and it was actually more diluted than it could have been. So the real deal is actually very important. So Manuka honey fits on wounds when you are dealing with a wound that is in the debridement phase, when you are looking at a traumatic wound that is pretty dirty and where you want to debride it and get rid of all the dead stuff. I've done the pathway of most wounds here, which is they're either surgical, you did it deliberately under aseptic technique and you were aiming to get this wound as clean as possible before you made an incision in it, so you're minimizing the risk of surgical site infection, or you have a traumatic wound where you had very little control of what went on and you're going to have to try and decontaminate the edges of the wound, but that wound is going to go through the inflammatory process whether you like it or not, and you help that along by helping to debride it either surgically or mechanically, or you can do that autolytically with your Manuka honey to get yourself a healthy granulating wound, which should begin within about 4 days, and once you've got a lovely bed of granulation like that, the chance of infection is minimum, which is why you then choose your method of reconstruction, because you know that's going to be maximally effective. You stop using honey when you've got granulation tissue formation because the pH of 3.4 and the high sugar content is mildly irritant to those fibroblasts, and that's just going to prolong inflammation. And what you do see sometimes is in lower limb wounds, if you use honey for too long, they kind of overgranulate and they look quite wet and they just don't progress. And that's usually because they're too wet or you've used it for too long. So you want to start to reduce the honey once it starts to granulate and switch over to something that is more compatible with fibroblasts and healthy cells, which is what the hydrogels are for. So the hydrogel is designed to do that. So the thing to remember about honey is when you put sugar on wounds, a bit like if you make a fruit salad and you put sugar on it, and I know when we have barbecues in the UK it's a very rare thing, so everyone forgets how to make a salad, and you put the dressing on 3 hours before just so that you want to make sure that you're ready for everything. You find that when you come back to your salad you've got a pile of water in the bottom and a few soggy leaves and it all looks pretty horrible. And that is osmotic action. That is the same that happens with salt when you put it on things, and it's the same when you do it with sugar. So initially, when you put honey on a wound that's slightly sloughy, you will get a lot more fluid than you expect. And the first time you use honey and you take the dressing off, it's better not to have the client with you, because you take the dressing off and you go, oh my God, it looks horrible because it looks sloughy and gooey. But that's exactly what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to draw all that through. So there is a new product available to the portfolio that SV have got, which is this super absorbent dressing, which is almost like a nappy technology, and it has crystals in it which absorb masses of exudate. And we're talking about maybe 200 mils of exudate, as opposed to the foam dressings that a lot of people use, which will maybe be 20, 30 mils. So a large one of these will hold almost a whole can of Coca-Cola or a whole can of Pepsi. It's that big. And for that reason, if you use it on a patient like a cat here, you've got peritonitis or you've got a wound that is heavily discharging, you may have a, let's say, there's a bigger cat, that one, but if you've got a 500 gram patient, and your dressing weighs 200 grams when it comes off, you have got 200 grams of protein in that dressing that was in the patient. And that means that you've got an awful lot of protein to make up for when it comes to that patient having rehydration and food. And in human healthcare, if you have a large wound, like a 10 centimetre diameter wound on the limb or an ulcer, you're lucky enough to get 1/3 more calories if you're in a nursing home, you will be topped up with extra calories by 1,000 calories per day if you have a wound, because it's a protein-hungry process that needs all that protein to remodel. I saw a patient in the UK with a wound who was, I always say, we healed it with chocolate. Can you believe that chocolate heals wounds? I mean, you can believe anything, really. Everybody's tried everything on wounds. The strangest thing I heard about being used on a wound was human placenta, which is fine if it's your own placenta, but I'm not so comfortable with someone else's, if you see what I mean. They were actually put in a tube and marketed, which is very strange. But I don't think the DNA situation would allow that these days, but there we are. So what was I going to say? Where was I? Without talking about weird stuff that you put on wounds. So yes, you need to replace the proteins. So knowing if you use a dressing like this, you expect a lot of exudate. It's not a silly thing to weigh the dressing before you put it on and weigh it when you take it off, which is what we have done with some large wounds in the past. So yes, so the lady that was healed with chocolate, which is where I was going. This poor lady, she had a wound after a hip surgery. She had a stroke, unfortunately, when she, sort of a few weeks later, and the wound started to break down because she had dysphagia and she couldn't swallow. And in the UK, I don't know if you know about the NHS, but they're not very effective at giving you, feeding you. There's some policies that mean it can take up to 10 days for you to have a central line put in if you can't eat. So they will give you a nasogastric tube, but there's at least 3, 4, 5 days wait before you do that. So these patients get cachectic, they get so that they are actually using more protein, and this wound unzipped like a zipper, and it just wouldn't heal. And what they found actually is in the nursing home, because she was immobile, they had to turn her every 2 hours, but they found that she could actually suck a small piece of chocolate. She used to be a chocoholic. I always say her owners, but I mean her family, said that she used to be a chocoholic, so she actually healed with squares of chocolate every 2 hours. She was able to suck chocolate, and she upped her calorie intake by about 2,000 calories a day, and the wound started to heal, and it was healed within a month. Isn't that amazing? One place not to have be off your food in the UK. I used to work for a company that sold parenteral and enteral nutrition, so the fluid bags and the bags that. And the policy at the time was it was 10 days before they would decide to give you a central line. Can you imagine not eating for 10 days? It's just unbelievable. Yeah, anyway, so there we go. So exudate management is all about using products that are materials that absorb. It's really no more scientific than using a sponge or something that's made of seaweed that helps you soak up because it's got lots of fibres in it. Alginate's okay, but if it dries out, it sticks to the wound and you end up with fibres and they can be very difficult to remove. But the foam dressings are designed for moderate exudate, so a wound that is just producing low to moderate amounts of exudate, and then you have these very super absorbent dressings that are for much more exudate. So I'm afraid it's a bit like the story where you look at the wound. Do you have Goldilocks as a story here? Do you know the story of Goldilocks? You maybe have your own stories. But really what you're doing is when you look at a wound, you look at the wound and you think, how many days is it going to need this dressing in place? And when you take the last dressing off, you look at that and you think, is this dressing very wet? Is it very dry? If the dressing is very dry, you knew you could have left that on for longer. If it's too wet, you knew you needed to use something more absorbent. It's judging it as you go, which is another reason why continuity of care, the same person looking at the wound every time, will make a massive difference to dressing choice. Because when I was working in human health care, you would get a different nurse visiting an old lady every day, and they would read the notes and they would go, dressed as plan, dressed as plan. And every day they would dress it the same way as the lady before because they were too scared to make a decision, and you ended up with these poor ladies having these same dressings for months and months, and no one was actively working with the wound management process. So, to promote wound management, it's just about looking after the wound bed, looking after granulation tissue. How many of you think that's a beautiful granulation bed? It's beautiful, it's lovely and healthy. That would be ready for reconstruction. You could put a graft onto that. That may speed up the process a little, even if the whole graft doesn't take. If you get some epidermal cells that are going to take in there, that will potentially, if I can draw a point in there, if you put a punch graft in here and you've got that punch graft to take, the distance those cells have to travel means the epithelial cells are going to go from the middle to the edge, from the middle to the edge. So you halve the healing time. Do you see what I mean? Even if it doesn't take particularly well, and that's why pinch grafts are so good in horses. You can have a 10 centimetre diameter wound. If you have one graft taken in the middle, you've taken that 10 centimetre wound so that the actual diameter now is only 5 centimetres for it to travel, and it makes a massive difference to healing time. So it's worth trying them. Look up skin grafting and how to do it. The secret is actually to only do it when you've got a healthy granulation bed so that the tissue is most viable to accept it, and then to ensure that that wound doesn't move within the first 7 days, or at least the first 3 days is critical. If you can stop it moving, then everything will start to go together. So I'm just showing you that the hydrogels are here, so you know what they look like. Actually, the Cruiser hydrogel has got the addition of polyhexamine biguanide in it, or polyhexamide, and that is used as a preservative, not necessarily as an antimicrobial, but it does have an antimicrobial effect. So it does mean that it stays in the tube a bit longer. You can put it in the fridge. I'm not telling you it's supposed to be single use, but the polyhexamine means that you can store it in the fridge with the lid on, or the client can take it home and they can use it at home if they want to use the rest of it. And then there's the foam dressing, which you can see there. So really that's kind of the physiology of wound healing and how you match dressings to the wound. So the idea is wounds will go through phases. They start with the inflammatory phase, or if you have a wound that has been in the inflammatory phase and it's kind of black, so this is where the pizza principle comes in. If the wound is black, you get rid of the black stuff. Underneath that, you'll often find the yellow stuff. Then you get rid of the yellow stuff. And during inflammation, the exudate tends to be highest. So you match dressings that absorb exudate during inflammation. So typically you use something that's absorbent, like this super absorbent one. And then as the wound starts to granulate, you get lovely healthy tissue. Moist wound healing is ideal. So unfortunately, as they granulate, they can potentially start to dry out. So you can start to donate moisture with your hydrogels and cover with a polyurethane foam, and the foam polyurethane on the back of it stops the moisture evaporating through so that the wound doesn't dry out. If you use a melalin, or those non-adherent melalin dressings that are made of cotton, their job is designed to absorb exudate and allow it to evaporate so that it dries out. So I call those dry dressings, and we now know that wounds will heal 30 to 50% faster if you keep them in a humid environment where they stay moist for a bit longer. So finally is the protect side of things, where you actually have to look at protecting against the factors that delay healing. So you've done your debridement, you've got your wound dressings sorted, you know which dressing you need to balance. It's almost like climate control. You balance the climate of the wound, and now you're going to have to protect it against the factors that could risk everything going wrong. So in this case here, this is a picture of a wound that has gone quite wrong. And bandaging angels, the reason I set up the bandaging angels is a lot of the cases that we get inquiries about are bandaging injuries. Things go wrong because the bandage is too tight, or it's too loose, or there's been an accident, or the client is not very good and they have let the dog run, or they've let the bandage get wet, or they haven't kept the dog indoors when they've said so. So a bandage is a very dangerous thing. As you can see on this flexor surface, oh, pardon me, it can go down to tendon quite quickly. So I don't know if you do a capillary refill test, if you do it on your thumb just to make sure you're all still conscious. I do like to check that. And what you do is you press your thumb and you can see that you're pushing the fluid, the capillaries, the blood is pushing out of the capillaries. Not very dramatic. The blood should come back within 3 seconds. If it's longer than that, you need to see someone at the back fairly urgently. But what you can see is it doesn't take a lot of pressure to blanch it. And that's what happens under a bandage. It takes 4 hours for that blanching to be enough to stop the blood flow so that the platelets start to aggregate. And what happens when they start to aggregate? They release their contents, and then they stimulate inflammation, and all of a sudden you start to get swelling. Now you're going to get swelling in a confined space in a tight bandage, and you start to find that that swelling will spread, and so will the damage, and that's why these bandaging sores can start with a prominent area. I do that because I've got a knobbly elbow. They can start with a knobbly joint, where you haven't got very much give underneath, there's no muscle, there's nothing underneath, so that ischemia is most prominent over joints where there's thinner skin, and that can progress to a sore quite quickly. Now, I don't want to frighten you all to death, because there are ways around that, and I'm sure you don't all get them, but thinner skinned species like greyhounds, sighthounds, animals with very narrow limbs are much more prone to bandage sores because the pressure will naturally be higher and there's less give in that tissue. So there's ways to offload that. So the thing about bandaging sores, and the reason they happen, is that the pressure that you exert on that skin, the focal point of that, if you press straight down and you press the table, you can feel the resistance. So you know that that table's pushing back at you and it's causing your blood flow to stop. Anyone had pins and needles? I hope you haven't got it now, sitting, listening to me, but pins and needles, you know that that blood flow has been inhibited and that the nerve endings are kind of telling you, you know, hang on a minute, stuff's not quite right here. So then you also have friction. So friction is when you rub your hands together and you can feel the heat. And if you're generating heat, that means there's energy going on. And if that energy is there, that energy is good enough to cause inflammation and trauma. And then there's shearing, which is where you push your hands together. And if you push them really hard and you push them up and down, the skin may not move to cause friction, but the joints move behind the skin. Do you see what I mean? So if I'm reading a book in bed, I'm sorry for the visual image, but if I'm reading a book in bed and I am really into my book, half an hour later I've slipped down the bed, but you know when your bottom still stays where it is and it feels it really burns, and that's your shearing injury. So people will often say that something is a burning sensation when there is a shearing injury. It's really uncomfortable. So in human healthcare, what they do is they give you satin sheets if you're prone to pressure ulcers. And what you end up doing is slipping down the bed, down onto the floor, land on the floor and break your hips instead, which is not funny at all. I'm sorry, that isn't funny. My sense of humour is not funny. Well, I think it's funny sometimes. So shearing, you can reduce shearing by using things that have got very low kinetic energy, you know, shear tights. You can use shear tights on dogs that have got elbow hygroma, and if they're rubbing on the floor every time they sit down and get up, if you've got a dog that's getting friction on those areas, those very sheer tights, the very expensive ones, you'll find they slide across the floor instead of dragging and causing friction. So it's all about the physics. So unfortunately, you tend to get all of those forces all in one place, exactly where you don't want it over joints. Oh, sorry. Do you want me to start again? No, that was a no. Okay, so this is definitely one to take a photo of. If you're taking photos, take a photo of this, because this is the law of bandaging injuries. This is why stuff goes wrong. So this is called Laplace's law. He's French, and he discovered that if you have a column, so a tube, and I think it was more for engineering than bandaging, but it works. If you have a tube, and that tube is narrow, if you wrap it with the same material as you do a wider tube, so you've got a whippet or a greyhound, and then you've got a Labrador or a bigger dog, you use the same bandage, and the whippet may break down, but the Labrador doesn't. Do you see what I mean? Because it's a narrower limb, the pressures will be higher, it's more prone to ischemia over the knobbly joints. The next thing is the width of the material. The wider the material, the lower the pressure. So if you have a whippet or a greyhound and you use a narrow lots of bandaging material, so orthopedic underpadding, conforming, and the cohesive layer, the narrower you use, the higher the pressure will be. So you see how you're adding risk to everything? So if you find it more easier to use a 5 centimetre because it looks neat, but you're doing it on a greyhound, you're doubling the risk of that dog having a pressure sore. So we recommend 10 centimetre diameter materials. The bigger the better for the thinner skinned narrow breeds. The next one is the tension. So the harder you pull it, the tighter you pull it, the higher the pressure. Obviously that's pretty straightforward. So that's why it's important to unroll the cohesive layer the right way round, so like unrolling a snail rather than pulling it tight. And then the one thing that people often don't realise is that the more layers that you add, the higher the pressure. So it depends what layer you're talking about, but how many people put more layers of orthopedic underpadding because they think it's going to rub over the stifle or somewhere, or over the Achilles? If you think about that orthopedic padding, what it does is it compresses over time. It gets compressed flat, which means that you end up with more room inside your bandage. It moves around a lot more. You end up with more friction and more movement within the bandage. So the two things that we get called in for as bandaging angels to correct in practice is that people will have sores over the hocks, and they will think that they've been bandaging too tight. So then what they do is they bandage more loosely, and then they get wounds over the flexor surface like the one in the first picture. And then they get crazy because they lose their confidence, and everyone in practice is terrified to bandage, and it ends up being one person who does it because everyone else is terrified. And actually it's usually it's a more simple thing than that, is that the use of donuts. So to make a donut like this, which is around, how many of you have used these? Not so many of them? Okay, so the use of a donut is orthopedic underpadding, which you roll into a donut shape. It's very simple to do, and I've got a video online somewhere. I'm sure I can send a link. And you create that donut to fit over the knobbly joints, over any prominent areas that you think might break down. And if you incorporate that into your orthopedic underpadding layer, so you put that on first. If you've got a wound already over your hock, you put your wound dressing on, you put your donut over the top, and then you bandage as normal over the top. But you only need 2 layers of orthopedic underpadding up and down. Don't keep padding out, because that just doesn't work. And then the other thing to think of is that legs aren't necessarily all one shape. So unfortunately, they're not one column. You tend to find that they get narrower in the middle here. You can see these Achilles tendons here, and you've got those kind of dips either side. If you were to look at those from the top, it's kind of more this shape, more like a kind of a egg timer shape. So what you've ended up with is a leg that isn't a tube, where there's different levels of pressure in different areas. So what you can do is, you see the tendon, the deficit between the tendon, is you can use your orthopedic underpadding and put strips inside that. So you just cut a small strip, fold it into, put it into that deficit, and then what you've done is you've turned something that was that shape into more of an oval shape, so that when you apply your bandaging, you get more even pressure all the way around. Do you see what I mean? That's a bit of a hard way to explain it. It's not, yeah, it's difficult to explain. I need a piece of orthopedic. Have you got tissues or napkins or anything? No. Oh, yes, give me a tissue. Give me a tissue. Round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. So I will walk over there, but I'll come back. So if you have your orthopedic underpadding, you can have a piece of it like this size, this shape, fold it in 2, and then down like side, there, put it inside that space, and then hand it around, and then that space is no longer a gap, and you don't get the pressure on the back and front, so you get pressure that will sit front and back, but still this deficit, then you end up with an oval, and the pressure is even all the way around. You don't get then high pressure on that tendon. Does that make sense now? Yeah. Excellent. So it's all about turning legs into tubes and making those tubes nice tubes that you're going to bandage with the least possible risk, and that's the art of bandaging. So we teach bandaging, we don't use stirrups, so we don't apply stirrups to legs. The reason for that is that the lovely vets that taught us, who are very specialist indeed, said that if you apply a bandage and you need stirrups to hold it up, then your bandage is too loose. And the other thing is that we don't tend to put tape around the top, because the tape that you use, that zinc tape, is very aggressive and it can make the skin very angry and very sore. So my message for the bandaging is be confident enough to bandage firmly, but use a donut if you think that if this patient is vulnerable to breakdown, and you'll find your bandages are actually an awful lot better, and I know a lot of people have said that works. The other thing is we tend to advocate open toe. So we actually bandage to leave the tips of the nail so that you can see them, and we find that the patients get a better proprioception, they feel better. But we only do that if the wound is above the carpus. If the wound is lower than the carpus, then we put the foot in the bandage, but we tend to find that better. Okay. And then if a bandage may not be an option, sometimes you can't bandage at all and you want to hold some dressing in place. Some of you may have heard of a tie-over dressing. We practiced these today. They were quite good. I'll show you one in a moment anyway. But these medical pet shirts are really handy to cover up those tie-over dressings, to cover up limbs, especially when you've got wounds that are nearly healed. We like them quite a lot. So the time is 9 o'clock, and I know we've got food coming. So can I show you a case study? I've got a lovely case. This is one of the cases that people send us, and I hope you like it. Oh, it's true that wounds heal despite what we do. Don't be too afraid, because they will heal anyway, most of the time. This is Dave. Dave is a pug, and Dave was brought in by his very doting owners who, Dave had an abscess on the top of his head, and the abscess, all the slough came off, and the owners brought him into their general practice vet, not a specialist. I went, Dave, what do you reckon? I think it looks like a chickpea. Do you know a chickpea? One of those white peas. They're really tasty. Yeah. You have them with curry sometimes. I don't know which dal it is. So obviously he's got his skull here, and you've got some granulation tissue and a little bit of an epithelial margin, so it's trying to heal. Anybody see a problem with this bone exposed? So exposed bone is a little bit like the desert. Nothing's going to grow there unless you give it the nutrition and the blood supply to keep the hair growth over the top. So in order to get vascular tissue over the top of the skull here, we need to do something about it. So there were some techniques that were looked at. I know that, have you ever had patients with an exposed jaw where you have an avulsion injury? It often happens in the UK when dogs have been bitten in a fight and they pull the jaw, the tissue off the jaw. You end up with exposed bone and very little option for reconstruction, because you cannot reconstruct without a wound bed. You can't reconstruct onto something without blood supply. It's just going to die. So Dick White, who I've seen use this technique, actually gets blood supply from the bone itself by using a Kirschner wire, and actually makes holes in the bone. The vasculature from within the bone actually then starts to granulate out, and it will start to cover the mandible. So rather than taking the mandible off, he gets the blood supply from the bone, which grows out, and then he can do an advancement flap that comes forward, and he could hardly even tell that the dog had had any issue. So it's really amazing once you know the anatomy. It's like one of those magic things that you didn't even know was there. So we were looking at this, and I was saying, could you do trepanation, make holes in the skull so that the vasculature would come through, and then he would be able to heal, and it would all heal nicely. But unfortunately for Dave, he's also a pug, so his eyes are not good. So now we need to consider that wound contraction might pull his little scalp up and make his eyes poke out even more. So not so good for Dave. So we actually got advice from, I always seek surgeons' advice because I'm not a surgeon. My job really is the piggy in the middle, but I hear everything that everybody says, which is fantastic. So I get to hear what that one says and that one says, and I learn as I go along, so I can guess what they're going to say. But actually he said, do you know what, let's use a hydrogel on this, not honey. The reason we didn't use a honey, it wasn't sluffy. So the way it goes with honey is it's yellow stuff for yellow wounds, clear stuff for clean wounds. Does this look infected to you? No, not much inflammation, it's granulating. We've just got exposed bone. The periosteum could dry out. If that dries out, it could necrose, you get sequestrum. So we used a hydrogel and a foam dressing over the top while we decide what to do with it. And then Dave got a tie-over dressing. And the tie-over is the loops of suture material that go around the wound. And you can loop those. You must do 6 of them at least, otherwise the dressing falls out, because they fall out the corners. And then those loops are used to tie your tie-over dressing. And underneath that tie-over dressing, you can put your hydrogel and your foam, and you can leave that in place for 2 days, and those suture loops actually stay in place quite happily for up to 2 weeks. So instead of bandaging and trying to bandage, have you ever tried to bandage a pug with no nose? It's not going to work very well. He was quite happy with his little head bandage. And then they didn't mind that there was bone there. The specialist that we were speaking to said, you know what, we think it's going to be all right. We advised an advancement flap or rotation flap. So you do need a specialist to help you with this one. Used a drain. So using a drain is very sensible, and this is an active drain rather than a passive drain, so that means it's going to suck the exudate out to stop the seroma, because seroma formation could mean that this doesn't take, it will just fill up with fluid, and then the whole thing just dies back. But they did this rotation flap, and do you want to know what the warning was from the specialist to tell the owners about this, the potential consequence of this technique? You'll see it at the end. He said, Dave is going to have the most fantastic hairdo when you've finished. Dave is going to have a toupee. So we'll see what Dave looks like in the end. So we got updates of this picture of the Dave the dog. What do you reckon? Is it taking? Isn't it? The vet was a bit nervous at this point. You see the dead bit at the end. So the rule with flaps generally is a flap can support the blood supply of a flap unless it's a cutaneous artery, but the blood supply of a flap can usually support 2 times its width in length. Does that make sense? So the width of the flap here, that bit there, blood supply will usually get enough pressure to support 2 times its width, so about that far. So it's not surprising a bit at the end maybe died back. And look, it's dying back just about where we expected it to. But what do? Well, actually, they left it and just let it demarcate and find its own way. No need to cut it off. Dave's actually well. He's not infected. There's no inflammation. So Dave came back in a few days, a week or so later, and you can see that's looking pretty good. Exactly 2 times the width of the flap and the dead bit at the end. And we had a little bit of a bet on after the next picture. So I had a little bit of a very informal wager with the surgeon, the specialist. And what happened is that bit died off. Now look what happens underneath when you've got a dead bit. It stays in the inflammatory phase, it's still yellow. As soon as you get rid of the dead bit, it's amazing what happens. It started to granulate in good old, poor old Dave. And we looked at this picture and I said, 2 weeks, it's going to be gone. And he said, no, it'll be a month. I said, 2 weeks, because I did my maths and I was a bit cocky. And 2 weeks, it had gone. Now look at that, isn't that amazing? Poor old Dave. Now that scar tissue can be a little bit fragile, so I'm going to give Xarasil a plug. But if the owner wants to do something to keep that tissue supple, and actually also it's useful for is when you've got that crusty tissue around the edges, you can use the Xarasil to keep that moist but without using a dressing on it, and it stops it sort of getting crusty and dry. You can massage that in, and if you massage scar tissue, it actually helps break the collagen down and it promotes tensile strength. So you can put that on. It's a very gentle moisturizing layer that acts as a barrier. Now, do you want to see what happened to Dave's hairdo? Dave unfortunately got a corneal ulceration, not related, and he lost an eye in the process. But Dave lived for 2 years with his toupee, and the owners were absolutely delighted. And it took less than 2 months for him to be totally fixed, which is absolutely amazing. So, moral of the story. I was going to show you something else. Moral of the story is be like Dave, be brave, but ask for help. And you can always, it's getting a good outcome for the patient at the end of it. So I think that's a good note to end on, but a good example of a really nice case that uses all the techniques that we've been going through over the last couple of days. But if you need help, let us know, let SV know, because they're going to have access to us and we're going to make sure we support you all as much as possible. So I think that's enough for tonight. I'm here all evening. If you've got a case and you want to show me and you want to talk about it, feel free. I'm all yours, and thank you very much. Thank you. All right.
Okay, everyone, it's time for dinner. So again, make your way through the double doors at the back. And as Georgie said, she is available for the rest of the evening.